Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something that I know can be a little bit intimidating for folks, especially those of us in public service, and that's tech.
Tech can be challenging, yeah.
But I think we'd all agree it's essential, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when we're talking about making government work better for citizens.
Right.
And luckily, there are resources out there to help us navigate this landscape. And today, we're diving into one in particular. It's the updated De-risking Government Technology Guide from 18F.
A fantastic resource, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. And what's so cool about this guide is that it's not just some theoretical document. It's actually built from real-world experiences, both the successes and, yeah, let's be honest, sometimes the failures too.
Well, that's how we learn, right? I mean, it's about taking those lessons, those hard-won lessons, and turning them into actionable advice, giving folks a roadmap, especially when it comes to those tech projects that can be a little tricky,
Absolutely.
especially in government.
So let's jump right into it. Imagine this. You're tasked with creating this brand new online portal
Okay.
for citizens to access government services. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Simple enough, yeah.
But then you start digging in, and all these questions pop up.
Of course.
Do we go with off-the-shelf software, or do we build something completely custom? How do we ensure that whatever we create actually works for the people who need it most? And that's where this guide is so valuable, because it really jumps into this dilemma head-on.
It's funny, choosing between, let's say, buying software or building custom, it's a little bit like deciding, do I need a car to get me to work, or am I building a spaceship to go to Mars? The answer, like you said, depends on what you're trying to achieve.
That's a way cooler analogy than the one I was going to use. I was going to use the suit one, but I like yours better.
I like that one too. But it's about understanding your mission, right? Understanding your resources. And like you said, thinking about those citizens, the people you're serving, and what they need.
And that's something that this guide really emphasizes, right? There's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to technology.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the needs of your specific project, the resources you have available, and most importantly, who you're ultimately serving.
Exactly. It's asking the right questions. It's about figuring out, okay, what are my must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? What are the long-term costs and benefits of going down one path versus another? It's about making informed choices, not just, jumping at the shiniest new tech toy.
Right. And speaking of making choices, the guide really doesn't shy away from those complexities, especially when it comes to custom software development. One thing that stood out to me, and I'll admit, it's not a phrase I use every day, was this emphasis on human-centered design. So for those of us who aren't necessarily tech wizards, can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean in practice?
Sure. Human-centered design. It sounds a little jargony, but it's really about putting people at the heart of the design process, right? It's about understanding their needs, their behaviors, their pain points. The guide actually shares this cautionary tale about a state benefit system that totally flopped. And the reason it flopped, because it was designed for the system, not for the people who actually needed to use it. And what happened? You had all this frustration, delays, and ultimately a failure to serve those citizens who needed it most.
And that's a really important reminder, isn't it? Because good intentions only take us so far, right?
Right.
We have to be really intentional about how we design and implement these systems.
Absolutely. And the good news is the guide doesn't just tell us, hey, don't do this. It actually gives us concrete examples of what we should be doing instead, like user research, for example. Go talk to the people who will be using this technology, right? Understand what their challenges are. Test those assumptions you might have.
So it's about making sure the technology actually serves its purpose, right?
Correct.
Not just looks fancy on paper.
Exactly. And this actually leads us to another critical aspect that the guide addresses, and that's managing vendors.
Ah, yes, the vendor dance.
Yeah.
How do we make sure they're actually delivering what they promised on time and within budget? Those are always the big questions, right?
Right. I mean, think of it this way. You're hiring a contractor to, I don't know, remodel your kitchen. You wouldn't just hand them a bunch of money and say, good luck, right?
Right.
You'd want a detailed plan. You'd want clear milestones. You'd want a way to hold them accountable.
Well, in government, the stakes are even higher, right? It's not just our kitchens we're dealing with. We're talking about public funds, services that impact entire communities.
Absolutely. And that's where performance-based contracting comes in. And the guide, it really dives deep into this. It's about setting clear expectations, defining measurable outcomes, and making sure that those vendors are incentivized to deliver results. It's about being good stewards of taxpayer dollars.
Making sure every investment actually delivers value for the public.
Right.
So we've talked about choosing the right approach, whether that's off-the-shelf software, custom-built solutions. We've touched on the importance of human-centered design, the art of managing vendors, and I know there's even more that this guide dives into, but before we go there, I want to pause for a moment. What about you? What's resonating with you so far? Any questions popping up in your mind?
That's a great question. Let me think about that for a second. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2024-11-14, part 2 of 3. One thing that really stood out to me is that the guide doesn't just focus on building new systems. It actually acknowledges that a lot of us, especially in government, are dealing with, well, let's just say legacy systems.
Oh, the dreaded legacy systems. We've all been there.
Exactly. Systems that feel like they're running on, like, floppy disks.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
I once had to use a system where you literally had to print out a form, fill it out by hand, scan it back in. Talk about a time warp.
Oh, I feel your pain. It's frustrating.
It is.
And it's not just about inefficiency. It's about how those outdated systems can actually impact our ability to serve the public.
Right.
But you know what I appreciate about the guide? It doesn't pretend that we can just rip and replace every legacy system.
Right, because that's not always feasible, is it?
No, not at all. But it encourages us to approach these systems with, kind of a fresh perspective. Like, how can we apply those principles of human-centered design to improve what we already have?
Okay, so it's not necessarily about throwing everything out and starting from scratch.
Not always. Sometimes that might be the best option, but often there are ways to make things better without, going nuclear. It might be about streamlining a process, making the user interface a little more friendly, or even just finding ways to integrate with newer systems.
So like giving those old systems a makeover.
Exactly. And you'd be surprised what a difference even small changes can make in terms of like the user experience. And the guide really stresses this. Even with legacy systems, talk to the users. Do that user research. Find out what's working, what's not working, what would make their lives easier.
It's about bringing that human element back in.
Absolutely. And speaking of human-centered, can we circle back to performance-based contracting for a second?
Sure.
Because I have a confession. I've always found that term a bit intimidating.
You and me both. It sounds very, official.
Yeah, bureaucratic. A little scary.
A little scary.
But the guide actually breaks it down in a way that makes sense. It provides clear explanations and even like concrete examples of performance-based contracting clauses that we can actually use.
Okay, so it's not just about throwing around jargon, it's about giving us practical tools.
Exactly. It's empowering, really.
So for those of us who are less familiar, can you give us an example of what one of those clauses might actually look like?
Sure. So instead of just saying, the vendor shall deliver X by Y date, you might include a clause that actually ties payment to, specific performance benchmarks. Like, payment for phase 2 will be contingent upon achieving a 90% user satisfaction rating on the new online portal.
So it's about shifting the focus from just completing tasks to actually achieving outcomes.
Exactly.
But I could also see how this could potentially create more work, right? On our end.
That's a fair point. I mean, it does require more upfront planning, thinking carefully about the metrics that you're using to measure success. But the guide argues that this effort is worth it.
Because ultimately, it's about making sure that we're getting the best value for our investment, right?
Right.
And more importantly, that we're actually delivering those services that truly meet the needs of the public.
Now you're talking. That's the whole point, right? Yeah. Aligning incentives, making sure everyone's working towards the same goal, better outcomes for those citizens that we serve.
I'm really starting to see why this guide is getting so much attention. It's not just theoretical. It really does feel like a roadmap.
And you know what else I like about it? It acknowledges the challenges that we face as public servants. It doesn't, sugarcoat things. It meets us where we are. And I think that's what makes it so valuable.
It's like having a trusted advisor by our side, right?
Exactly. Someone who understands the realities of government work and can help us navigate these tricky tech decisions. And it's more than just a guide. It's a call to action.
Yeah.
Like, it's not enough to just read it and nod our heads. We actually have to take these insights and put them into practice.
So what would you say to a public servant listening right now, someone who maybe feels a bit overwhelmed but is eager to make a difference? What's that first step they can take? Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2024-11-14, part 3 of 3.
Well, I'd say the first step is just acknowledging that, tech isn't some side issue.
Right.
It's really core to how we do our jobs, right? How we deliver services, how we interact with the public.
Absolutely.
So step 1, get a copy of the guide. It's free. It's online.
Easy to find.
Super easy to find. And you don't have to read the whole thing cover to cover.
Right.
Just pick a section that speaks to you, maybe something related to a project you're working on, and just dive in.
I love that. And I think as you're reading it, don't just think about your own little silo, right?
Right.
Think about the bigger picture. How can we use this guide to advocate for change within our agencies? How can we be champions for this more human-centered approach to tech?
That's such a good point. Because this guide, it's not just for the techies, it's for everyone who cares about making government work better.
Absolutely.
It's about empowering all of us to drive real positive change.
And speaking of change, remember, this guide, it's just the beginning, right?
Yeah.
It's a framework, a set of principles to kind of guide our thinking and our actions.
Yeah.
But the real work, the real magic happens when we take those principles and apply them to our everyday work.
Totally agree. And that work can be messy, it can be complex, it can be challenging, but it can also be incredibly rewarding.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this challenge. The next time you're faced with a tech decision, big or small, ask yourself, what would this guide recommend? And even more importantly, how can I use this information to truly make a difference for the people we serve?
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive, it's been fun. We've just scratched the surface though, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's so much more to explore in the guide. So check it out, share it with your colleagues. Let's keep this conversation going.
Because ultimately, it's about more than just tech, right? It's about using tech to build a better future.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged.
And stay tech savvy.